Hello, how are you today? Let's take a look at the cultural news. What's going on in the world of cinema these days? Well, Steven Spielberg has just made a new film that should come out soon. Great, I'm so pleased. Spielberg is my favourite director. I've seen all of his films so far and I won't miss this one. But what's it about? Well, it's about Abraham Lincoln. It probably deals with the life of this famous American president. Now, it's not the first film to talk about Lincoln's life. In 1939, John Ford made a film called Young Lincoln. And according to the critics, it's worth seeing. Did you know that Lincoln was assassinated? Just like John Fitzgerald Kennedy, another American president. Yes, they were both shot dead whilst fulfilling their duties. A president's job can sometimes be perilous. But before dealing with Lincoln's death, let's talk about what kind of a man he was, what he did, where he lived, and so on. Abraham Lincoln was the first Republican president, and he was elected twice, once in 1860 and then in 1864. Now, he became famous because his name is linked with two major events in the history of America: the Civil War and the abolition of slavery. At this time in America, the United States was also known as the Union and consisted of 34 states instead of 50 like today. Before his first election, Lincoln was a committed lawyer and he was elected to Congress as a representative of Illinois in 1846. He was opposed to the war against Mexico, which he considered as unconstitutional and unfair. But his voters were not pleased and they judged him unpatriotic. Consequently, he was not re-elected. So he focused his attention on his job, in which he excelled. As a result, he gained the reputation of being a brilliant and honest man. In 1854, he was again elected as congressman, and he began expressing his anti-slavery ideas, even though he fought against the right to vote for the blacks. Lincoln also fought against the admission of pro-slavery states into the Union. It is worth noting that anti-slavery ideas began germinating at this time in the US, as the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin proved. In 1860, he was chosen as the presidential candidate by the Republicans, who hoped to see him triumph in the next election, which he did. And on the 6th of November, he was elected the 16th President of the US. In the wake of his election, 7 of the states decided to secede from the Union. 6 of them, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, and Texas, formed the Confederate States of America. But Lincoln refused to acknowledge their independence, and in the days that followed this tragedy, numerous death threats were made against him. He even escaped certain death when a bullet pierced his hat and not his head. But that would be for another time, as I said before. On the 12th of April, the Civil War started in South Carolina when the Confederates attacked Fort Sumter. 3 days later, Lincoln sent 75,000 volunteers, and Virginia and North Carolina, who refused to allow the soldiers to cross their territory, seceded too. They were accompanied by Tennessee and Arkansas. At the end of April, Lincoln ordered the blockade of all the Confederate harbors, preventing all forms of trade with them. 1862 did not bring any change, and the war continued, and a tax was set up to finance it. But one important event occurred. Lincoln proclaimed the emancipation of the slaves, even in the Confederate States. His proclamation gave birth to two amendments. The first abolished slavery, and the second guaranteed civil rights for all. On the 1st of January 1863, the slaves were emancipated. In 1863, the Homestead Act was signed by Lincoln. Now, this had nothing to do with the Civil War, but it was a very important act as far as the conquest of the West was concerned, as families who had lived in the same place for 5 years could now claim property or buy at a very low price if they had occupied the same place for at least 6 months. In 1863, West Virginia became the 35th state in the Union. But the war continued, despite Lincoln's efforts to put it to an end. 500,000 volunteers were recruited, and the northern states won an important victory at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. In November 1864, Lincoln was re-elected with 55% of the votes, and in 1865 he asked the Confederates to surrender. But the latter wanted their independence and negotiations failed. However, on the 9th of April, the Civil War officially ended, and Lincoln and Grant, who had commanded the armed forces of the Union, met to discuss the reconstruction of the southern states. Unfortunately, on the 14th of April, whilst attending a play in Washington, Lincoln was assassinated at the age of 56 by John Wilkes, a pro-Confederate. This time, the bullet shot at point-blank range penetrated his brain and killed him instantly. A great humanist had just died. 4 people were sentenced to death for this criminal act, and among them a woman who became the first woman to be executed by the US government. Legend has it that Lincoln had dreamt about his assassination 3 days before it happened. Abraham Lincoln is buried in Springfield, Illinois, in a fortified crypt built in 1901. This was the 17th removal of his remains. Such precautions were necessary as his coffin had been opened 5 times since his death. According to a survey, Lincoln is one of the most admired presidents in US history, and is considered as many as one of the most influential Americans in history. His name was given to the capital of Nebraska, and a monument, the Lincoln Memorial, was erected in Washington. His effigy appears on US coins and banknotes, and his face was sculpted on Mount Rushmore. What's more, his birthday became a bank holiday until it was decided that this day should honor all the American presidents. If I had to remember one of his numerous sayings, then it would be this one. Whenever I hear someone arguing for slavery, I have a strong impulse to see it tried on him personally. Don't you agree? Well, if you want to find out more about Lincoln, go and see the film. I'm looking forward to it. Bye for now.